Deer season. It was deer season in Neil's sleepy rural town, which left him very few options as a regular hiker. Moving to the northern country landscape of Georgia was a no-brainer for someone like him, who required at least 3 hours of every afternoon to recatalog his thoughts, blow off the accumulated stress of the day, and get the creative juices flowing as a writer. This daily regiment became such a necessity for him, with his freelance job as a travel columnist for a local magazine, that if he didn't get out in the fresh air, rain or shine, for his required 3 hours, he would spend the rest of the evening staring at a blank computer screen and thinking up excuses to push back his story deadline another couple days. This routine was so tried and tested that when it came time to shop for new apartments, a moderate to difficult hiking trail within 15 minutes of his front door jumped to the top of his pro and con list, above washer or dryer or security detail. After moving to the Blue Ridge Mountains of Georgia, he spent his spring, summer, and winter navigating his favorite trail in his backyard, which he visited without fail every day, to the point where the squirrels came to know him and ceased bothering to scurry up the trees to escape his eye. It became a rare trend for any of his writing assignments to make it in late to his lead editor's desk, and he remained fit and full of energy. And then deer season came along, and his favorite trail was suddenly locked down with a gate and padlock. Most disappointing of all was the fact that this was fall, unarguably the most seasonal time of year for hiking. His first thought was that there was still plenty of room to squeeze through the gap in the gate or step over the chain. However, the thought of crunching down a dead, silent trail with all the unknown gun sights swinging around the screen of trees was enough to cause hesitation. He wasn't wearing bright colors for one thing, and he didn't think he owned any sort of clothing that would help him stand out from his background. It wasn't worth the risk, even though he thought it common sense that any hunter would hear him coming a mile away and know the difference between his haphazard steps and the graceful, stilt-like strides of a deer. Still, just imagining his own image in the crosshairs of a scope, even for a moment, while a hunter's finger was poised on a trigger, was enough to turn him away. For the first time in his life, he was actually thinking about joining a gym, but a part of him knew that his creative juices were triggered by the fresh air and sunlight as much as the cardio stimulation. So he looked up the other trails in the area and could find very few that didn't cut through the designated deer hunting blocks. All except one. He found this one after scrolling through satellite images of the acres to the north, south, east, and west of his favorite hiking spot. He could see the gravel trail winding up the hillsides of pine and pecan trees. But when he cross-referenced the coordinates with his trusty search engines, he couldn't find information on any of the previous owners or whether it was government land. It looked to be overgrown from what he could see, and there were certainly sections of fence separating it from the designated hunting grounds, which at least told him he could navigate the land freely without a target on his back. In actuality, this was all he was really looking for. However, trespassing on someone's private property introduced the same kind of issue, as it was legal in that state to shoot anyone on sight on your land if you were not invited. And then he saw that a section of the trail looped outside of the fence along a 3-mile stretch up and down the countryside. And he followed the course with his mouse cursor. Recording the coordinates, he was able to conclude that he could access the entrance to this path a half a mile from his usual trailhead, and by going off trail, he would be navigating outside of the hunting section. This all seemed doable to him, and he was ready to seek out the trail that day. It would require some backtracking, as the trail did not loop back to the starting point, but he thought that a fair compromise. As he plotted his course on his phone's GPS, he detected a structure captured in the satellite image that looked like the top of a complex, minus the rooftop. Thus, it resembled a winding maze. Looking down from above, and he had to wonder who had built a complex. It looked military in formation, but it was as overgrown as the trail, and he had to conclude that it hadn't seen a caretaker in some time. There was no doubt in his mind that he was peeking beyond the curtain into someone's private property, intended to be sanctioned off from public scrutiny. But was it still operational? He could not be sure. The trail continued straight into the heart of the man-made labyrinth, and he figured he would decide when he got there whether it was safe enough to push further. From what he could see, a chest-high fence separated that property from the public trail, which wouldn't be too difficult to hop if he had enough conviction. And it didn't take him long to find the trail, as his plotted course on his phone led him directly to a natural clearing of sorts, where the distant cannon of gunfire at his back did little to set him at ease. He kept an eye out for ticks in the tall grass as he blazed his own trail, using his phone as his compass. He was thankful that he had taken a screenshot of his makeshift map, as there was no cell signal out there in the boonies. There was the mouth of the gravel path, as the computer had predicted, with weeds growing wild from the center, but 2 tracks were still visible, evenly spread apart, as if a cart or train had once wound up the mountain from that spot. Neil gratefully followed, flattening the grass in the center of the trail as he went so that it would be easier to follow back to the clearing. And soon he had replaced his sunglasses with a stocking cap. As he was in the trees now, he breathed deeply through his nostrils and became lost in thought, thinking on his own writing assignment for the magazine, which he thought would center on off-trail navigation through the woods, including survival tips and tricks for safe navigation. Write what you know, he'd always been told. It was quite common for him to lose track of the time when he was brainstorming as he was, and that was exactly what happened. He looked up from his feet, and he saw that the private property sign served as a wall directly in front of him. A caveat followed this, claiming that violators would be shot on sight, and the fence looked much gnarlier in person than it did on his computer screen. It was wrapped in razor wire, and it was higher than chest height, now at about his chin. The trail curved slightly and ran parallel with the fence for a stretch longer, so he took it, attempting to glimpse over the top of the fence post as he went. He couldn't see the complex of labyrinthian walls from his vantage point, but he knew they weren't too far away, as if the builders knew they had to maximize the space and extend the complex as far to the fence boundary lines as possible. Then he came to the final dead end, where the fence cut across the trail. Neil wondered what had come first, the fence or the trail, and he had his answer as soon as he came in for a closer look. There was a padlock and swinging gate built into the fence, also covered in rusty barbs. At one time, a passing vehicle could have pushed the gate open on its now hardened hinges and continued on into the private property. Perhaps if he had some bolt cutters or a simple ladder, he could do some exploring, but he had already hiked his 3 miles, and another 3 down the mountain seemed apt enough to finish the narrative he was constructing in his head. But as he turned from the gate, he heard a man scream out, and he looked further down, following the line of the fence into a clutch of bramble bushes, at a clear human figure sticking half in and out of the gap between 2 of the fence posts. The barbed wire had all been peeled away and stuck flat to the fence with a piece of particle board, which had probably given the man the freedom to wriggle as far as he did through the slit. He was wearing a gray uniform, soiled and partly shredded from the barbs, and he was emaciated, swimming in his clothes, with patches of hair on the top of his skull. He had one arm free on Neil's side of the fence, along with his head, whereas the other half of his body was clearly wedged on the other side. He screamed for help, waving Neil closer, but he was careful not to raise his voice too loudly. His calls came across as forced and hushed. Neil hesitated from his place on the trail, but he was able to drop his guard slightly when he found the source of the emergency. A bracelet around the man's wrist, located on the restricted part of the fence, was caught on the fence post. "Are you stuck?" Neil ventured to ask. The man nodded his oversized head vigorously, and Neil had to wonder how he'd squeezed such a melon through that fence. As if reading his mind, the man explained as calmly as he could. "I was trying to get on the other side of this fence. I was on that trail like you. I just wanted to see what was over there. I only got halfway through, but my arm got caught." "You've never been on the other side?" Neil continued. "No, this was my first time out here." "But the particle board," Neil said. He noticed that it was on the other side of the fence. "I found that out here and positioned it over on that side." This seemed believable enough, but he still didn't move from his spot to help the man. "Come on and help me get free," the man hissed, more commanding than before. "What are you wearing there?" Neil asked. "It's my work uniform," the man said, without skipping a beat. "I work in the concrete factory down the way. This is my lunch break." "And why did you decide to come out here?" "Why are you here?" he shot back, which caught Neil off guard. "I just wanted to see where this trail goes. Now I couldn't care less, as I've been stuck like this for 2 hours." "What's that around your wrist?" It didn't look to be a bracelet or handcuff of any kind Neil had seen before. It was metal in composition, and it was tight around the wrists, so tight that it looked like the man's arm was broken, hanging loosely and in a twisted angle against the fence post. "I think I broke my wrist trying to wrench free," the man said. "I can almost squeeze through now, but it's so painful. I just need your help pushing this bracelet up and out from the post. It'll only take a second, man. I may die out here if not. My vision's already starting to cloud." "All right, 1 second, Neil said, stepping over a tangled root to approach the fence. "Thank God you came by, man." Neil watched as the man used his free hand to brace his weight against the bough of a nearby tree. His other arm was clearly crippled, so Neil felt comfortable enough to square up with the man and reach in through the gap in the fence to touch the cold steel of the bracelet. It was smooth and highly polished, so that he could see his reflection in the steel. "You didn't tell me what this bracelet is," Neil said. "It's a little embarrassing, but it's my probation bracelet," the man said matter-of-factly. "I've had a few too many DUIs, and this will alert the police if I leave their jurisdiction. It will also alarm once I'm out of it, but this seems like a life-or-death kind of situation." "Damn, it's really wedged in there," Neil huffed as he grabbed it with both of his hands. "Get your fingers in there. Use them as a brace against my own wrist. I'll have to squeeze out." Neil did as he was instructed and wrapped his fingers around the underside of the bracelet, pushing the back of his hand against the man's bruised flesh. The man groaned in pain, and Neil in turn squeezed more of his hand through the bracelet, pulling as hard as he could, and then he felt something shift, where the bracelet suddenly cracked open, expanding just enough for the man to slip free and collect on his knees in the grass. But the bracelet quickly clamped down on Neil's hand, still pinning him to the fence post. The only free digit was the top of his thumb and a section of his wrist. As he cried out in pain, the man whooped with glee behind him. "What did you do?" Neil roared. "If you ever get free from that post, and that bracelet's still in your hand, I wouldn't try going past this fence," the man said to him seriously, now a safe few steps away. From his new safety zone, he cradled his wounded wrist. "You set me up," Neil cried. "That device around your hand is reactive to your size," the man explained. "It's designed to expand if you gain weight, for instance, and restrict if you lose it. By pushing it to its maximum sensitivity there, we were able to get it open just enough for me to get out. But once it sensed your hand, it compensated and restricted again." "What the hell is this thing?" "It's meant to prevent you from leaving the boundary of this fence," he explained. "I'm from the mental hospital at the top of the hill there. It's a free-range compound, so we're allowed to fend for ourselves for a lot of our sentence, as long as we don't venture too far. I purposefully broke my wrist, hoping I could wriggle out. Otherwise, if you get to the other side of the fence with the bracelet still on, it sends thousands of volts through your body and will fry you on the spot. So I suggest you find a way out of them." "Mental hospital? There's nothing like that listed in this area," Neil argued, yanking harder now on his restraint. "If you know what kind of shit the doctors up there are into, you'd understand why that place isn't advertised." Neil couldn't crane his neck far enough to see, but the man sounded like he was further down the path now, back at the point where Neil had once stood. "I'm really sorry about this, but you know what you need to do to escape. I'd get help, but they can't know I breached the fence. I wish you all the luck." "No, you can't leave me like this. I tried to help you. I saved your life. If you get into the maze, always take the right path," the man yelled further down the path this time. "They can't go right. They can only turn left, and they'll always be right behind you." "No, wait, wait!" But he could hear the man's boots crunching with the gravel on his way down the mountain. Neil leaned all his weight forward as far as he could, pushing against the fence post until it felt like it was bending. And with half of his body through the gap, he thrust his hip against the post until he heard a shriek of metal against metal and his wrist was suddenly free, and he was on his hands and knees on the dirt, with the bracelet still fastened across half of his hand. But he was on the restricted side of the fence now. His first thought was that he could easily slide through the slit, especially with the fence posts bent away. But the man had warned him that the bracelet would electrocute him if he carried it past the boundary line. He didn't feel confident enough to test the truth of his words. If it was true what he said, he was a mental patient in a hospital, so it was unclear if any of his statements could be taken as gospel. He had lied to him almost too casually to ignore when they first laid eyes on each other. But looking at the piece of equipment on his wrist, he could confirm that it was unlike any kind of bracelet he'd ever seen. It had appeared to open and close on its own accord, as the man had described, so what else could it do? Neil decided that he didn't want to find out, but maybe he could find something to break the bracelet with, as he wasn't quite ready to snap his own wrist to be free of it. But looking at the quickly setting sun in the sky, and trying to ignore the sudden chill on the wind, he wasn't quite prepared for. He wondered how far he might be willing to go in order to be free of the alien piece of technology. Thus he ventured further from the fence, through the trees, and into the clearing. He came upon the opening to the maze of partitioned walls, sticking straight out of the grass like oversized playing cards. The walls were riddled with bullet holes and were stained black with soot or scarred with fire, including what looked like the pockmarks of mortar shells. He could only think now that this was once a training ground for soldiers, as he'd seen on TV or in movie theaters. His first instinct had been right. The government must own this land, or they'd laid claim to it at one time. The man had said that they couldn't take the right-hand path within the maze. Whoever these they were the current owners of this maze. So Neil took his first right into the maze and continued on, until he reached the next bend, and he again took a right, as he was instructed. Further along, he began to notice that the walls all had metal handles built into them, like doorknobs, and he saw a lot of what looked like blood or some dark paint splattering the grass. Neil figured that he could slip the bracelet through one of these handles, like the former owner had done with the fence post. Then maybe he could slip the rest of his hand free, but he began to hear what sounded like footsteps behind him, large, deliberate crunches in the gravel, and not like the military-grade boots the supposed inmate had been wearing on his flight down the mountain. These were long, pronounced heel-toe steps, almost mechanical in their movements. He only stepped long enough to listen and dissect the noises. But the footsteps sounded so alien and close that he could never stop for long. The steps were scraping and prolonged, like the sole of a rubber sandal grinding with sand. When he tried to conjure up an image to accompany these sounds, he was met with the same blockade. Maybe what he was hearing were more inmates like him, weighed heavy by the bracelets on their wrists. Then he reached a dead end, a solid wall. If he wanted to continue forward, that would mean backtracking, and even turning left somewhere along the way. Now the sun had ducked beyond the man-made horizon of these partition walls, and he was lost in the shade. And the footsteps were quickly gaining on him, so close now he could hear the labored breathing of someone, and it sounded like it was coming in closer and closer. If the stranger had been following his same route, then he wouldn't be able to meet him in his dead end, not if he couldn't take the right-hand paths. But it was difficult to determine what path it could be taking, and whether it was coming from the other direction. When the breathing became too much to bear, he pushed up against the barrier in front of him and was surprised to feel it give slightly, like the fence post back at the trail's end. He touched the handle, drilled into the wall, and had his first idea. As per usual, his mind had been working furiously as he hiked, playing out possible scenarios of how to best break his wrist and be done with the bracelet. And now he thought he'd found his answer. Part of him had already been prepared for the pain, so it didn't take much conviction on his part to slip the bracelet onto the handle in the door so that the cold metal was flush against his wrist. Now his bone was braced between the handle and the bracelet, and he counted down from 3 in his head before thrusting his shoulder into the walls once, twice, and then a third time, so that the partition began to sway. And when he caught enough momentum on the other side of the oversized pendulum, he heaved all his weight against the door and followed it into a crashing crescendo forward. Everything happened so fast, rocking and rattling every bone in his body, that he didn't even feel the pain of his broken wrist until he was collected and back on his feet with 2 bare hands and the bracelet hanging uselessly like a ring-tossed toy on the fallen door's handle. Now he was free, and although a brand new course had opened up for him, all he could think to do was go back the way he'd come. Unfortunately, this meant turning left the entire way. At least he knew he had a surefire way out. All he would have to do is follow the left-hand paths back to the trail. This was much more attractive than the thought of stumbling his way to the other end of the maze, and risking more dead ends. And for what? For the unmade promise of another exit at the end of all those passageways? What if there was only a mental hospital on the other side of that acreage, as the former inmate had claimed, run by doctors as unstable as the ill people they imprisoned? He stopped to listen, and he no longer heard any ragged breathing or footfalls. Whoever had been following him had become as quiet as him. The collapsing wall had certainly caught the ear of any living, breathing thing for miles around, and he didn't want to be there when anyone, or anything, came by to check on his unwarranted destruction of property. He collected the bracelet from the handle and followed the wall with a quickening pace, his injured arm tucked protectively against his chest. Although he stopped periodically to listen for any more sounds, he heard nothing but the rustle of trees and his own labored breaths. Then, around one of the last corners, he caught sight of a dark shape out of the corner of his eyes. But it wasn't standing in his intended pathway, but further along the corridor, looking straight his way. He seized up against the wall and caught his weight against one of those handles. The light wasn't good, but he could see that it was a head and shoulder shape with a hood and cloak. But in the fading sunlight, it was unclear if the figure was wearing a wicker mask, or if its face was so characteristically ridged, and it looked to have some kind of dark blinders positioned over its eyes. Thus, even though they were both looking in the same direction, the figure had not noticed Neil, as far as he could tell. It was standing very still, though, head poised to the side, as if listening. The ridges on its face worked thoughtfully, and Neil watched its snout wrinkle with a clear sniff at the air. Below this snout was a muzzle, complete with metal bars, which glinted like chrome teeth in the diminishing sunlight. Neil might have thought the thing was a statue if he hadn't seen it lift a cautious arm, revealing a clawed hand from out the interior of its sleeve. It reached blindly for the nearest handle on the wall, and Neil quickly deduced that was how they navigated the maze without their eyes. And it took a step closer to Neil, testing the gravel with its clawed foot, and gaining purchase there before taking the next one. He watched it reach out with the same hand, its bony wrist passing between the handle and the wall like a thread through a needle, before clicking its claws together and grabbing hold. Neil found the nearest handle, just inches from his left elbow, and he attempted to slide the bracelet over the handle so that it was nestled against the wall. That way the thing would reach through the bracelet as well as the handle, but it was so difficult to see that he almost dropped the bracelet, clinking metal against metal, and causing the creature down the path to growl beneath its mask. He heard its robe swish crazily, and its toenails clicking on the ground, as it came at him quicker than ever. He was too afraid to turn and look. He fumbled with the bracelet, making sure it would not slip off the handle, before taking off in a dead sprint through the corridors, and taking every left corner, as if it was his last. And the creature was screaming now behind him, but it didn't sound like it was far. just right around the next bend, keeping even pace with him. He thought about taking a right and testing the truth of the man's words, but he was so close now. He could sense it, and he had never been so happy to see the trees and darkening sky before, now free from the obstructive maze walls. But he couldn't find the section of fence with the razor wire pulled back. He ran well past the point he was sure he'd entered from, but everything looked so different in the dark, and the monster's wheezing was so loud in his ears. The entire forest seemed to fall into a prolonged hush at the presence of this abomination on his heels, and Neil responded with the most primal, ungodly scream he'd ever uttered in his life. Its sound came as such a surprise to him, but not as much as the guttural snarl that came back from his pursuer. His only saving grace in the twilight was the particle board leaning up against the fence, which was a shade of color unlike the rest of his surroundings. He clawed his way through the gap, feeling the bite of the barbs on his stomach and chest as it tore bits of clothing and flesh away. He got halfway through and felt his hip bone snag on the same fence post he'd battled before. He pushed with all his might until he heard bone grind with the metal, and that was all drowned out by the sounds of kicking gravel as the thundering footsteps skittered to a stop, bracing for an impact with him. He felt the thing's breath on his ear as he slipped free and continued with his forward momentum down the path. He heard the fence clatter, and then there was a heavy thud and vibrations beneath Neil's shoes as the fence posts were no doubt ripped out of the ground. He could even feel the pebbles bounce off the back of his legs as the fence fell inward and collided with the earth. The thing shrieked, and Neil thought it had tangled itself in the barbed wire, and that these were exclamations of pain. But he saw that it was on his side of the fence. But it was writhing, back bent awkwardly, to reveal bare bone ribs poking out from behind the veil of its robes. Neil could see that the shiny bracelet, once attached to his hand, was now clamped on the creature's wrist, and it was electrocuting him. Neil paused long enough to watch smoke emanate from the folds of its robes, now reduced to its knees, with its claws digging in the dirt, and then its head exploded in a spray of red brain matter. And Neil didn't wait to watch its bony body collapse in its robes. He booked it down the trail, thankful to have all his limbs and working legs that could carry him back to civilization. As he ran, he wondered how much of what he now knew could be translated into a believable article for his travel magazine. All he knew for sure was that he was much more confident to brave his usual trail. Deer hunters be damned. But come to think of it, a gym membership didn't sound half bad either.